Right now, as you watch this, somewhere in the world a port is closing. A cargo ship is turning back. A trade route that's existed for generations is quietly dying. And no one is screaming about it. No alarms are going off. This is exactly how it happened before. 3,200 years ago, the most advanced civilizations on Earth didn't fall with a bang. They fell with a whisper. Palaces emptied. Scribes stopped writing. Ships rotted in harbors. And the people who lived through it probably didn't even realize they were witnessing the end of everything they knew until it was far too late. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't a single catastrophic event. It was a silent unraveling that took place between 1225 and 1130 BCE, and it destroyed empires that had stood for centuries. The Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittites, the great cities of Ugarit and Pylos, all gone. Trade networks that connected 3 continents simply stopped functioning. Writing systems disappeared. Entire ways of life vanished into what historians now call a dark age. But here's what should terrify you. The collapse followed a pattern. A sequence of failures that stacked on top of each other until the whole system came crashing down. And that same pattern is visible today. Not in ancient tablets or archaeological ruins, but in our supply chains, our climate data, our geopolitical tensions. The warning signs aren't written in linear B script anymore. They're written in shipping manifests, drought reports, and the quiet desperation of farmers watching their wells run dry. History doesn't repeat, but it absolutely rhymes. And right now, we're hearing the same dark poetry that preceded one of the most catastrophic collapses in human history. This is the story of the Bronze Age collapse, the silent exodus that ended a golden age. And this is why you should be paying attention to what's happening right now. The world that was understanding the interconnected Bronze Age system. To understand how everything fell apart, you first need to understand what was lost. The late Bronze Age wasn't primitive. Between roughly 1800 and 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East operated as the world's first truly globalized economy. Think about that. Over 3,000 years ago, civilizations separated by thousands of miles were deeply interconnected through trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. The Mycenaean Greeks controlled fortress palaces at Pylos, Tiryns, Mycenae, and Thebes. These weren't just castles. They were sophisticated administrative centers that tracked everything with meticulous detail. Scribes using linear B script recorded land ownership, livestock counts, grain rations, and even the assignments of ship crews on clay tablets. Every aspect of society was documented and controlled from these palatial centers. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire coordinated vassals and managed grain distribution through their central bureaucracy at Hattusa, their capital city estimated to house 40,000 people at its peak. The Hittites had something else too. They controlled iron production, giving them agricultural advantages and military superiority that made them rivals to Egypt itself. Meanwhile, Egypt under the New Kingdom pharaohs was at the height of its power. The temples of Karnak stood as monuments to their wealth and influence. Cities like Ugarit on the Syrian coast thrived as major trading ports. The island of Cyprus produced copper that was shipped across the known world. These weren't isolated kingdoms jealously guarding their borders. They called themselves the Club of Great Powers, and they meant it. Letters between kings reveal a complex diplomatic network where rulers addressed each other as brothers, negotiated marriages, and settled disputes. Trade goods moved constantly across vast distances. Copper from Cyprus, tin from as far as Afghanistan or even Cornwall in Britain, ivory from Africa, wine from Greece, olive oil from the Levant, gold and precious materials from multiple sources. Archaeologists have found oxhide-shaped copper ingots in shipwrecks throughout the Mediterranean, proof of standardized trade practices. Egyptian papyri reference timber imported from Lebanon. Mycenaean pottery shows up in Egypt. Cypriot crafts appear in palaces across the region. This was sophisticated, long-distance commerce on a massive scale. Bronze itself, the defining technology of the age, required this global network to function. Bronze is 90% copper and 10% tin. You couldn't make it without both metals, and they rarely occurred in the same location. The entire economic system depended on maintaining these supply chains. Without tin from Central Asia or copper from Cyprus, you couldn't make the weapons, tools, plows, and wool mechanisms that society depended on. The military power of the age centered on chariot warfare. These weren't simple carts, they were sophisticated weapons platforms manned by highly trained warriors. A typical battle might involve hundreds or even thousands of chariots. They would race laterally across enemy lines while archers fired compound bows in complex maneuvers that required years of practice. Chariots could quickly deploy anywhere, making them perfect for suppressing rebellions and projecting power. They were the Bronze Age equivalent of modern rapid deployment forces. This was the world at its peak, an interconnected system of trade, diplomacy, military power, and cultural exchange that had created unprecedented prosperity. Cities were growing. Art and architecture flourished. Literacy expanded among the elite classes. The myths and religious beliefs spread and merged across cultures. It seemed permanent. It seemed unshakable. It seemed like it would last forever. But complex systems have a fatal flaw. The more interconnected they become, the more vulnerable they are to cascade failures. When one part breaks, it doesn't break in isolation. It pulls other parts down with it. And around 1250 BCE, the first cracks began to appear. Not with thunder and drama, but quietly, in ways that seemed manageable at first. A drought here, a raid there, a trade ship that didn't arrive. Small problems, individual failures. Nothing that threatened the entire system, or so it seemed. The first tremors, climate change and environmental stress. The collapse didn't announce itself, crept in through the weather. Around 1250 BCE, something shifted in the climate of the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. The rains became unreliable. The seasonal patterns that farmers had depended on for generations began to fail. This wasn't a single year of bad harvest. It was the beginning of a 300-year drought, the driest period in 3,000 years of climate history. We know this from multiple sources of evidence that converge on the same terrifying conclusion. Analysis of fossilized pollen grains from across the region shows a dramatic shift in vegetation. Scientists examining sediment cores found that the driest period throughout the entire Bronze and Iron Ages occurred between 1250 and 1100 BCE. The Sorek Cave in northern Israel contains a 150,000-year record of precipitation patterns preserved in mineral deposits called speleothems. Oxygen isotope analysis of these formations reveals an unprecedented and steady decline in rainfall that continued through 1150 BCE, reaching levels significant enough to cause widespread crop failures. Pollen records from multiple sites confirm this wasn't a localized problem. It affected the entire region simultaneously. The evidence points to a fundamental change in seasonal precipitation patterns. Agricultural lands that had supported cities became marginal. The growing season grew increasingly unreliable. Subsistence economies, which operated with little margin for error, quickly reached breaking points. But even the most sophisticated palace economies, the ones with grain storage and redistribution systems, found their capacity to cope rapidly eroding. The agricultural crisis created cascading problems. When harvests failed, the palace systems that redistributed food came under enormous strain. Farmers who couldn't feed their families abandoned their land. Labor forces that maintained irrigation systems and infrastructure began to disappear. The detailed records kept by Mycenaean scribes and Hittite administrators now documented shortages rather than abundance. Archaeological evidence shows that some regions responded by intensifying their agricultural practices, trying to squeeze more production from degrading land. This worked temporarily but accelerated soil exhaustion and environmental degradation. The climate change was accompanied by seismic disasters. Geological evidence suggests a series of major earthquakes struck the region between 1225 and 1175 BCE, what scientists call an earthquake storm that essentially unzipped the plate boundaries of the eastern Mediterranean over a 50-year period. Modern seismological maps of the region show that Bronze Age destruction sites line up almost perfectly with known earthquake fault lines. Sites that showed fire damage and collapsed structures match the pattern you'd expect from major seismic events. Structures in the Bronze Age were far more vulnerable to earthquake damage than modern buildings. A palace or fortified city that survived a major quake might still be compromised. Walls weakened, water systems damaged, storage facilities destroyed. Even if the earthquake didn't completely destroy a site, it could render it militarily vulnerable and economically crippled. The combination of drought and earthquakes created what systems theorists would call a vulnerability cascade. A city weakened by earthquake couldn't defend itself properly. A region suffering crop failures couldn't feed workers to rebuild after disasters. A palace system strained by environmental stress couldn't maintain the military forces needed to protect trade routes. Written records from the period reflect growing desperation. The Hittite king wrote frantically to trading partners, "You must furnish them with a large ship and a crew, and they must transport the grain to their country. You must not detain their ship." This isn't the language of a confident ruler managing normal trade. This is panic. This is a king watching his supply system failing and knowing that his empire's survival depends on keeping grain flowing. The pharaoh Merneptah recorded that he caused grain to be taken in ships to keep alive this land of Hutti. Egypt was sending emergency food aid to the Hittites, historically their enemies. When rivals start depending on each other for basic survival, you know the system is breaking down. Climate change didn't cause the collapse by itself. Droughts had happened before. Earthquakes had struck before. Individual civilizations had weathered these challenges and survived. But the Bronze Age world was different. It was interconnected. When environmental stress hit multiple regions simultaneously, it didn't affect isolated kingdoms. It stressed the entire network at once. And networks have thresholds. Push them hard enough and they don't bend, they break. The cascade. When complex systems fail. By 1200 BCE, the pressure had built to critical levels. The environmental stresses were bad enough, but they were about to collide with military threats and political instability that would push the system past its breaking point. This is where we see the pattern that makes the Bronze Age collapse so relevant today. Not any single cause, but the way multiple pressures stacked and amplified each other. The Sea Peoples appeared in historical records like a nightmare emerging from the Mediterranean. We still don't know exactly who they were. The name is a catch-all term for various groups of raiders who attacked coastal cities and disrupted maritime trade. Egyptian records mention them by specific tribal names: Peleset, Sheker, Shikalesh, Shardana, Denyen, and others. They came in ships. They fought on land. And they struck at the critical nodes of the Bronze Age trade network, the ports and coastal cities. The first recorded raid hit the Nile Delta in 1279 BCE during the reign of Ramesses the Great. The Egyptians defeated them, but the attacks continued. Ramesses III faced major invasions that he barely repelled in multiple campaigns: the Battle of the Delta, the Battle of Jahi, and others. Egypt survived these conflicts, but the economic cost was catastrophic. State treasuries nearly went bankrupt maintaining the military campaigns needed to protect their territory. Other regions weren't as fortunate. The destruction layer at Pylos in Greece shows a fierce fire that baked hundreds of linear B tablets into pottery. accidentally preserving them for modern archaeologists but marking the violent end of the palace and the administrative system it represented. The scribes who kept those meticulous records never wrote again. Other Mycenaean palaces met similar fates. Thebes had its palace sacked repeatedly between 1300 and 1200 BCE before being completely destroyed. Tiryns and Mycenae survived longer but eventually fell silent. These weren't just building fires, they were the death of entire governmental systems. Recent archaeological work has revealed something crucial. Many of these destructions didn't happen exactly at 1200 BCE. Some occurred earlier. Hazor's monumental structures burned in the first half of the 13th century BCE. Others came later. Sites like Miletus show destruction layers dating to 1130 to 1060 BCE. The collapse wasn't a single event but a rolling wave of failures that moved through the region over several generations. The Hittite capital of Hattusa was abandoned. Not destroyed in battle, just abandoned. Archaeologists found no massive destruction layer, no evidence of enemy armies burning the city. The population simply left. The great palace complex fell silent. The administrative apparatus that had coordinated an empire ceased to function. Ugarit, a major port city on the Syrian coast, sent desperate messages before falling. The last texts found there speak of ships arriving from hostile powers, of the king gathering his forces to meet an unspecified threat. Then silence. The city was destroyed and never rebuilt. Here's what makes this pattern so insidious. The trade network itself became a transmission mechanism for collapse. Bronze Age prosperity depended on long-distance maritime trade. The same ships that carried prosperity in good times became vectors of destruction when the sea peoples controlled the waves. A port city couldn't easily defend against sea-based raiders while maintaining open commerce. Close your port to protect it, and you cut yourself off from the trade you need to survive. Keep it open and you're vulnerable. It's an impossible choice. The supply of critical resources began to fail. Tin supplies from Central Asia became unreliable as trade routes dissolved. Copper from Cyprus became harder to obtain. Without these metals, you couldn't produce bronze. And without bronze, you couldn't make the weapons, tools, and agricultural implements that supported civilization. Some historians have suggested that the knowledge of ironworking, which was spreading during this period, may have contributed to the collapse by making bronze less essential. But iron didn't immediately replace bronze. It took centuries for iron to become dominant. The more likely scenario is that disrupted bronze supply chains created desperate searches for alternatives. Metalworkers who couldn't get tin and copper had to try working with whatever they could find, and iron was available even if it was harder to work with initially. Palace economies that had functioned smoothly for centuries suddenly couldn't obtain the resources they needed. The administrative systems that coordinated labor, managed food distribution, and maintained infrastructure depended on the palace's ability to pay workers and command loyalty. When harvests failed, when trade broke down, when treasuries emptied fighting defensive wars, that system lost its power. Workers and farmers who weren't being fed or paid simply walked away. The sophisticated bureaucratic machinery ground to a halt not because anyone conquered it, but because it stopped being able to fulfill its basic functions. The silent exodus. How civilizations die quietly. This is the part that should haunt you. The Bronze Age collapse looked less like Rome burning and more like everyone quietly deciding there was no point staying anymore. Archaeologists call it the silent exodus. Not because we have no evidence, but because the evidence shows something more disturbing than violent destruction. It shows abandonment, giving up, walking away. On the ground, collapse appears as a pattern of endings and gaps. At some sites, you find fierce fire that marks sudden destruction. But at many others, you find something different, layers of abandonment. Construction projects that started and then stopped halfway. Quality of craftsmanship that gradually declined over time. settlements that shrank as populations drifted away, fine bronze castings giving way to cruder metalwork. It's the archaeological signature of a system running out of resources, expertise, and hope. The most striking evidence comes from what disappeared: literacy. The linear B script used by Mycenaean administrators simply stopped being written. Completely. The knowledge of how to write it was lost so thoroughly that modern scholars didn't decipher it until the 1950s, when Michael Ventris finally cracked the code. An entire writing system vanished because the palace bureaucracies that used it ceased to exist. Without the palace's training scribes, the skill died out within a single generation. In shipwrecks and hoards from the period, you can trace long-distance trade becoming patchy and uncertain. Those are the exact words archaeologists use. Trade didn't stop completely. Fishermen still mended nets. Coastal trading vessels still moved goods between nearby ports. But the state-sponsored, wide-area exchange networks that connected Afghanistan to Egypt, Cyprus to Mycenae, Cornwall to the Levant, those shuttered and failed. The decline of reliable shipping ended more than commerce. It removed what scholars call the smoothing mechanism, the ability of maritime trade to move food from regions with surplus to regions experiencing shortage. In good years, this prevented localized famines. It moved charcoal and tin to furnaces. It allowed elites to maintain loyalty among followers through pay and spectacle. When that system failed, every local crisis became an existential crisis because there was no mechanism to buffer against disaster. Here's the thing that modern people struggle to grasp. Most people living through the collapse probably didn't understand what was happening. To someone living in a Mycenaean town around 1180 BCE, life just slowly got harder. The palace requisitioned more resources. Rations got smaller. Jobs became scarce. The quality of goods declined. Some years the harvest failed. Some years raiders came. Some years disease swept through weakened populations. Any of these things had happened before in isolation. But now they were happening constantly in combination without relief. When the palace system finally collapsed, it might have seemed almost like a relief at first. No more taxation, no more labor obligations. Only later would people realize that the infrastructure, the trade networks, the administrative coordination that the palaces provided, however imperfect, wasn't going to be replaced by anything better. What followed was what historians call the Greek Dark Ages, lasting from roughly 1200 to 800 BCE. During this 4-century period, population declined dramatically. Urban centers were abandoned. Art, culture, and literacy essentially vanished from the archaeological record. People continued to live, but in smaller settlements, with simpler technology, with no written records, with no grand architecture. The knowledge didn't completely disappear. Farmers still knew how to farm. Smiths could still work metal. Sailors could still navigate by stars and winds. But the complex, integrated, palace-controlled systems that had allowed Bronze Age civilization to flourish were gone. The specialists who knew how to organize large-scale construction projects, manage imperial administration, maintain diplomatic networks, they were out of work or dead, and they didn't pass their knowledge on in any systematic way. What's striking about the Bronze Age collapse is its scope. This wasn't just one civilization failing. It was a systemic collapse affecting multiple interconnected civilizations across thousands of miles. The Mycenaean Greeks fell. The Hittite Empire disappeared. Ugarit vanished. Cyprus was devastated. Egypt survived but severely weakened, never regaining its former power. The Levantine cities went through catastrophic decline. The only major civilization that weathered the storm relatively intact was Assyria, protected somewhat by its inland location and its focus on military power. But even Assyria emerged into a changed world where the old trade networks and diplomatic relationships were gone. Anthropologist Joseph Tainter defines societal collapse as when a society displays a rapid, significant loss of an established level of social complexity. By that measure, the Bronze Age collapse was one of the most complete collapses in human history. Political centralization dissolved. Economic specialization declined. Administrative capabilities vanished. Artistic achievement plummeted. The archaeological record shows continuity in some aspects of daily life. People still lived, farmed, made pottery. But the complex superstructure of Bronze Age civilization simply ceased to exist. The pattern repeats, recognizing the signs in our present. Now we come to the uncomfortable part. The Bronze Age collapse didn't happen because ancient people were primitive or foolish. It happened because they built a complex, interconnected system that was vulnerable to cascade failures, and then multiple stresses hit that system simultaneously. They couldn't see the full picture of what was happening. Each crisis seemed manageable in isolation. By the time the pattern became clear, it was too late to prevent the collapse. Sound familiar? We live in a world far more interconnected than the Bronze Age ever was. Global supply chains move millions of containers across oceans every day. Just-in-time manufacturing means warehouses carry minimal inventory. Everything depends on constant flow. A single semiconductor fabrication plant going offline can cause shortages worldwide. One container ship wedged in the Suez Canal can disrupt global trade for weeks. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed how fragile these systems actually are. We're experiencing climate change on a scale that makes Bronze Age drought look modest. Climate scientists document shifting rainfall patterns, increasing frequency of extreme weather events, regions becoming marginal for agriculture, and stressed water resources. The American Southwest faces megadrought conditions. The Mediterranean basin is seeing decreased precipitation. Heat waves routinely break records that were set just years before. Agricultural systems struggle to adapt while populations continue growing. We see geopolitical instability rising. Not a single threatening power, but multiple simultaneous challenges. Great power competition, regional conflicts, failed states, mass migration driven by climate and conflict, piracy and non-state actors disrupting maritime trade. The comfortable post-Cold War order where global trade seems secure and permanent is visibly fraying. We watch supply chain disruptions becoming normal. During the pandemic, we saw shortages of everything from computer chips to lumber to baby formula. These weren't caused by lack of resources but by the breakdown of complex logistics networks. Ships waiting for weeks to unload at congested ports. Warehouse workers absent due to illness. Transportation networks overwhelmed. Each disruption cascading through the system. We see declining institutional capability. Government agencies struggling to fulfill basic functions. Infrastructure deteriorating faster than it's maintained. Complex bureaucratic systems losing the expertise to solve problems effectively. Public trust in institutions eroding. This isn't about any particular political ideology. It's about the observable reality that many of our governing and administrative systems are performing less effectively than they did decades ago. We see the warning signs that scientists have identified as preceding systemic collapse, what they call critical slowing down. Recovery from disturbances takes longer. Systems that used to bounce back from shocks now show persistent effects. Variability increases. The system becomes brittle, seemingly stable until suddenly it's not. Research published in PLOS 1 demonstrated that catastrophic collapse can occur without early warning signals, particularly in structured systems where different components have different vulnerabilities. The populations that should show warning signs often don't, while the populations that do fail often collapse anyway. This research on silent catastrophes shows that by the time you recognize the pattern, you may already be past the point where intervention is possible. Here's what the Bronze Age teaches us. Collapse is a process, not an event. It happens through accumulated stresses, through the failure of system after system, through the gradual degradation of the mechanisms that keep complex societies functioning. People living through it often don't recognize it as collapse until it's far advanced. The Bronze Age world didn't end in 1200 BCE. It ended over several generations of rolling failures, abandoned cities, broken trade routes, and declining capabilities. And people kept living their lives through all of it, probably believing that things would return to normal soon. They never did. Not in their lifetimes, not in their children's lifetimes, not for 400 years. Some scholars argue we're already in the early stages of a similar process. The combination of climate change, resource constraints, political instability, pandemic disease, and economic fragility is creating conditions where cascade failures become increasingly possible. Others argue that our technology, knowledge, and awareness give us tools to prevent collapse that the Bronze Age world lacked. Both might be right. The question isn't whether we face similar pressures, we demonstrably do. The question is whether we'll recognize the pattern in time and whether we have the collective will to address it. The Bronze Age collapse teaches us that complex systems can fail completely. That interconnection creates both prosperity and vulnerability. That environmental stress can amplify political and economic problems until they become catastrophic. That by the time collapse is obvious, it may be impossible to stop. That literacy, trade, and entire ways of life can vanish within generations. The ancient warning isn't written in tablets anymore. It's written in climate data, shipping manifests, crop reports, and the stressed faces of people trying to hold complex systems together with inadequate resources. The pattern is visible. The silent collapse has begun. The question is, are we paying attention?